What were the circumstances that led to Charlie Company, 2nd 14th Battalion, attacking its own battalion headquarters? We look at mitigating the risks of blue-on-blue engagements.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Welcome to episode 111 of the Principles of War podcast, Friendly Fire on the Kokoda track. A couple of episodes ago, we looked at the taboo of self-inflicted wounds during the Kokoda campaign. Today we're going to look at another taboo, and that is friendly fire. Tragically, blue-on-blue engagements are inherent with combat operations. They are the product of the friction, uncertainty and doubt that we see in any tactical situation. The incidence can be quite high, and it sometimes goes unreported because the impact on morale is so deleterious. Operating in the jungle is very difficult, and it complicates the mitigation of blue-on-blue engagements. Visibility is cut to incredibly short distances. Command and control is very difficult to exercise. Maneuvering and navigation is also very difficult to achieve. These factors come together to create the difficulties for operating in the jungle. Before we get to the friendly fire incident though, we're going to look at maps. To do this, I'm going to draw heavily on Peter Williams' book, The Kokoda Campaign 1942, Myth and Reality, and in particular, the chapter on military intelligence. When we looked at the death of the CO of the 53rd Battalion, we discussed the training of young Lieutenant Rolly Logan. You might remember that he lost his platoon, walked into Battalion Headquarters without them and was told to go out and find them and to return. A young lieutenant, unable to navigate, that's almost a meme. But we know that he'd had no experience in navigating in the jungle, and on top of that, we don't know if he could read a map or not, but it didn't really matter because we do know that he wouldn't have had a map. There were no maps at that time. There would be many a junior NCO or junior officer who could relate to that middle of the night experience where you pull your map out and you're almost trying to divine where the position is, and you can feel the eyes of everyone in the section or the platoon bearing down on you, wondering if you know where we are. Last week we looked at the JIPOE, or the Joint Intelligence Preparation of the Operational Environment, for the Kokoda campaign. The key reflection to come out of that was the assumptions that Morris had made about the defence of Port Moresby. Operationally, air power would be decisive, that the Gap was a highly defensible place on the Kokoda track, and that the Navy would protect Port Moresby. He got 2 out of those 3 wrong. The Navy did protect Port Moresby during the Battle of the Coral Sea, but it was a near-run thing. Apart from stevedoring, the troops were employed in building airfields for aircraft that would come in such small numbers that they would make a minimal impact on the Kokoda campaign. And the Gap did not exist. If he had had decent maps, and there were maps, and it did actually list the Gap, however, there was no reconnaissance done of the Gap, which is the decisive terrain for the campaign. This created all sorts of issues for him. On the 13th of August, this is just 13 days prior to the Battle of Isurava, he receives a signal from General Sutherland, Sutherland being MacArthur's Chief of Staff, and it requested that reconnaissance be made of critical areas of the trail through the Owen Stanley Ranges for the selection of points where the pass may be readily blocked by demolition, and that the necessary charges be placed in the most forward areas and assembly for ready installation in the rear areas. We see here that MacArthur is thinking that the back door to Port Moresby is going to be easily closed. It won't be that simple. Australia should really have a home field advantage when it comes to situational awareness, given the fact that both Papua and New Guinea at this stage are Australian-administered territories. For the Japanese, it's a long way from the home islands, and it hadn't been on their strategic radar until really the late 1930s. There's an interesting diary entry from Captain Geoffrey Vernon. He'd been a doctor in the first AIF and had lived in Papua and New Guinea since 1932. He re-enlisted in February 1942 and was a captain in the Australian Army Medical Corps and attached to the headquarters of the 1st Papuan Infantry Battalion. He was renowned as Doc Vernon, or the Old Doc, and held in extremely high regard. He did incredible work keeping the local labourers fit and healthy and able to support logistically Maroubra Force. He wrote, "From Kagi towards Kokoda, there are many tracks. I know of 3 which cross the range at different places. Enemy captured maps show at least 4. Where their information comes from is a mystery." Japanese reconnaissance started in the 1930s, and for the aggressor it's a lot easier to be able to do that because they know where they're going to attack. However, the Japanese hadn't planned on New Guinea. Recon for Guam had commenced in 1932, but the first reports for New Guinea was only written in 1940. Here we see an interesting thread about how grand strategy had been developed for the Japanese. In the Dutch East Indies, there were 40 companies that employed over 1,000 Japanese civilians. In Rabaul and Guadalcanal, resident Japanese fed back intelligence. Working closely with commercial entities enabled the development of a whole-of-nation approach towards grand strategy. Interest in New Guinea increased in 1937, and the Caroline Maru, a Japanese freighter, visited 5 times with no obvious commercial reason. This raised the suspicions of both the Directorate of Naval Intelligence and the Commonwealth Investigation Branch. In January of 1940, there were no permanent Japanese residents in Port Moresby, but there was one Japanese company, the Nanyō Kahatsu Kaishai, or the South Seas Development Company. It had Japanese government contracts for the construction of infrastructure at Palau in Dutch New Guinea, which is now Indonesian West Papua. They developed an air route to Japan with pilots seconded from the Imperial Japanese Navy. This is a great piece of forward planning because now we've got pilots who are going to be bombing Port Moresby, flying out of Port Moresby. Training, reconnaissance, economic development, and intelligence gathering, all in one neat little commercial entity. And this is because Nanyō Kahatsu had signed a secret agreement in 1936 with the Imperial Japanese Navy to establish operations in Portuguese Timor and surrounding areas. There were further visits from the Caroline Maru and the Takachio Maru from 1938 to 1941. They brought English-speaking Japanese visitors who visited Rabaul, Salamoa and Wau. They hired aircraft, they took photos of the Wau airstrip, and they asked to buy maps. They were also seen taking grass samples. This is what you do when you want to know if your horses will be able to use the grass as fodder. They travelled around Gona and Milne Bay, they checked the depth of the water, and they verified the coral reefs against the charts that they had produced for them by the Japanese Navy. These charts were based off Kriegsmarine charts, and when the charts were viewed by a Royal Australian naval officer, he judged the charts to be of better accuracy than the Royal Navy charts that they were using. One IJN officer chartered a small boat and was able to go and navigate around all of the small islands, and he said he would have never been able to do that in a warship. We're starting to see the sophistication in the Imperial Japanese Navy's littoral capability and the ability to conduct amphibious operations. We're seeing them gathering the technical geographic data that they need to be able to conduct amphibious operations in the AO. The Japanese developed relations with the local Lutheran churches in New Guinea, who supplied them with local maps. When the Japanese landed in New Guinea, they brought German-speaking officers so that they would be able to communicate with people like Peter Mattis, who was a key leader in the Lutheran church. The Japanese have done their intelligence preparation of the battlefield, and they're now using that intelligence to be able to build a civil-military liaison capability. The Commonwealth Investigation Bureau was concerned about the Lutheran community because of the influence that they wielded within the local population. In December 1941, General Adachi wrote a paper about a course of action with an advance from Salamoa to Buna and requested more information on the area. This course of action was refined, and the information request became more important when orders from Imperial Headquarters came to the Nankai Shitai and the 4th Fleet that they should examine a land route to Port Moresby. The preferred route was through Kokoda. Studies were conducted looking at rainfall, roads and bridges, and food. Food was critical because of the Japanese emphasis on local foraging. This planning was occurring at the end of January 1942, so Singapore hadn't even fallen. And it wouldn't be until the 21st of July that the Japanese would first land at Buna. The orders to consider this approach in January 1942 would have come as some surprise to the Imperial Japanese Army, and they weren't exactly in favour of it. However, they'd already been gathering that information. Peter Williams, in his book, quotes from an army report written in 1944. Prior to the war, the Japanese had organised, along the lines of a general pattern elsewhere, a number of agents and spies throughout Australia. The consulate must have passed back a vast amount of information, and numerous special agents were sent to Australia to obtain information. One of these, a major in the army, made a complete tour of the country, noting down all the information of value to Japan. Others arrived in the guise of trade missions, etc., and contacted local Japanese in the various states. In 1941, both the DNI and the CIB were concerned that Japanese residents in Australia were purchasing maps of New Guinea from shops in Sydney. In June 1942, Prince Takeda Shunoyoshi of the Imperial Headquarters gave an English explorer's map to the staff of the 17th Army. Now, this would have been based on the work of either Ernest Chinnery, Cyril Jackson, or Wilfred Beaver. These had all been exploring and mapping eastern New Guinea from between 1913 up to 1930. These maps were available in Sydney in the Papuan annual reports. There were marked similarities between the Chinnery maps and those used by the Nankai Shitai. There was also an interest in books. A Canberran bookshop owner reported to the CIB a list of books that a Japanese customer had requested about New Guinea, and this included Evelyn Cheeseman's Two Roads of Papua. She was a British entomologist and she'd walked the track twice. It was her account of 2 months spent in the Eora Creek, Boona and Kokoda area. The book was definitely used as source material by Japanese cartographers. She had written in the book, "The road crosses Papua from coast to coast, starting at Port Moresby, passing through Kokoda and finishing at Boona." On some Japanese maps, she was quoted word for word where she had written, "Roads are unusually good about Kokoda compared to some parts of the territory." She's used the term road there. It's important to understand that the word road, track and trail was used interchangeably and certainly didn't denote the fact that you could get vehicles across it. The Japanese had very little expectations about using motor transport within Papua New Guinea, apart from along the coastal areas. One interesting character that the Japanese used extensively was Joseph Anton Hofstetter, who lived in Wau, Boona, Kokoda and Port Moresby for over 22 years. He was a Swiss national, but his family was originally from Bavaria, and because of that he had escaped the roundup of Germans in New Guinea. He may have had connections with Hans Schmidt Berk, who was the Nazi Party leader in the Wau Bololo area. It'd be interesting to know just how many people that Hans Schmidt Berk was leading, given the fact that he was in Wau, and that is quite a long way off the beaten track. When the Japanese invaded Rabaul, there had been a call for men to either join the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles or they would be sent south. It was at this time that he is said to have disappeared, and he reappeared in March when the Japanese landed at Lae. When the Japanese advanced on Wau in 1943, there were reports of a white man leading the Japanese advance, and it is thought that this was Hofstetter. During his time in New Guinea, Hofstetter had worked as a miner, and he may have flown into Kokoda to get to the Yotta minefields. He was named on some of the Nankai Shitai maps, or referred to as the Swiss informant or Swiss miner. Personnel from Angau tried to find Hofstetter after the war, but it appears that they missed an ATIS report from 1944 that stated that he'd been killed in action at Wau. We're going to now start thinking about the comparison between the maps that the Australians and Japanese had. What makes a good map? Well, the first thing is the scale, so the smaller the better. It needs to be gridded so you can understand distances, and you want to have contour lines, and that's going to show you the shape and steepness of the terrain. We know that Tsuji Masanobu thought that the maps in New Guinea were poor compared to the 1 to 100,000 maps that he'd used in Manchuria. If that name rings a bell, he played a fairly significant role in the Malaya and Singapore campaigns, and he's going to play a significant role when we look at the Nomonhan offensive. The maps that the Japanese did have, so the Nankai Shitai had maps that had been produced from aerial reconnaissance. They had no grid, no contours, but 12 seaplane flights from Lae had enabled maps to be created. They were of a 1 to 50,000 scale, they had no grid, no contours, but Major Koiwei Mutsuo of the 2nd 41st Battalion said that the maps of Eora Gorge were so good that he could easily establish his location and key terrain features. So the Japanese in August 1942 had good maps, not great. They were able to produce these maps with only 5 months' worth of notice that the Kokoda track may be of interest to them. And that was because they could leverage previously obtained maps, local knowledge, and integrate aerial reconnaissance to create very useful maps for the troops as they navigated their way from the beaches in the north all the way to Port Moresby. Let's compare and contrast that with what the Australians had. So the 39th Battalion, the first battalion up the Kokoda track, they had a list of villages in order from where they would be encountered and the time to walk between them. They also had a 1 in 300,000 map. This means that 1 centimetre on a map represents 3 kilometres on the ground. Compare and contrast that with the Japanese 1 to 50,000, so 1 centimetre equals 500 metres. That's a lot more detail that can be captured on the map. The 1 to 300,000 map for the Australians was quite useless. 21st Brigade, Brigadier Potts, he had scoured Port Moresby looking for maps and he had no luck. Captain Harold Jesser of the Papuan Infantry Battalion, he began his trip up the track on the 19th of February and he started collecting plantation maps, and then when there was no further plantations, he started making his own. On the 16th of August, so this is just 10 days before the Battle of Isurava, the 21st Brigade wrote that they had 1 aerial photo and 1 inaccurate map. That was all they had to be able to plan brigade operations. Battalions were taking their own gridded paper to map as they went, and the 2nd 14th had a 1 to 500,000 map, so they just made sketch maps as they went. For the Australians, this cartographic catastrophe is an issue at the operational level. New Guinea Force should have been looking to set the battalions and the brigades up for success with the information about the terrain that they were about to enter. There was a failure to capitalise on the local knowledge from the people who lived on the Kokoda track. There was a failure to find maps. Whether these had all been brought up by the Japanese, I'm not sure. But by the time that the 21st and 30th Brigade arrived in Port Moresby, there were no maps to be had. And it was a failure to anticipate the need to potentially fight on that terrain. Why? I'm not quite sure, because Japan had been long recognised as the significant strategic risk, but little had been done. So this impacts Lieutenant Rolly Logan as he's trying to navigate in some of the worst terrain to navigate in the world, and he's trying to do that at night. He's doing it without a map, he's doing it without any training. Is it any wonder that he got a little bit geographically embarrassed? You can only imagine how stressful that would have been for the young platoon commander. For Logan, the consequences were looking a little bit silly in front of the platoon and potentially the battalion commander thinking that maybe he'd be better off in battalion headquarters rather than wheeling and dealing a platoon. What about when you're a company commander and your company is a part of a battalion withdrawal whilst in contact? This is the situation that Captain Harry Dickinson found himself in. The battalion, 2nd 14th, is conducting a withdrawal. The pressure from the Japanese is mounting and they are threatening to cut off the lines of withdrawal for the battalion. The battalion was on both sides of the track that led south to Alola. To the east was the steep embankment that led to Eora Creek, and to the west was a steep timbered slope. Japanese had occupied those heights and were threatening to cut off the withdrawal to Alola. The CO, Lieutenant Colonel Key, ordered Charlie and Don companies to attack the high ground to ensure that the withdrawal proceeded without enemy interference. Let's go to the official history and see what it says there. Dickinson's company and Cameron's, the latter now consisting of only 2 officers and 32 men, with the 2nd 16th Platoon, were to clear any Japanese there off the track to make this withdrawal possible. As they swept forward at 4:50 p.m, the Japanese flung themselves against Buckler and Nye, who were holding the rear, and against Battalion Headquarters. A melee ensued in the small area which Key had been holding. As Key, with his headquarters, was ready to move, fire swept across the track and forced him and his group down the side of the precipitous V of Eora Creek. That is from the official history. However, when we look at Gavin Long's papers at the War Memorial, we find this. Key ordered Dickinson to relieve pressure on the battalion. Actually, Dickinson's attack swung in towards the track and Key and his headquarters were on the track, and Key thought Dickinson's attack with blood-curdling yells was a Jap attack. Suddenly, Key went down over the edge of the track to cover. What were Dickinson's orders? Dickinson's charge caused Australian casualties and caused a stampede among the troops waiting on the track. Some 2nd 14th, as a result, disappeared way across the valley. The 39th Battalion War Diary has a similar story. Captain Dickinson made a charge which carried all before it, not only the enemy, but also Battalion Headquarters and troops waiting on the track to withdraw. Lieutenant Colonel Key, his adjutant, intelligence officer and the RSM disappeared over the side of the hill, and the withdrawal was precipitated by a wall of fire coming down through the jungle with Charlie Company's charge. It's interesting because the official history doesn't mention it. Many of the books that cover the Battle of Isurava don't mention it. Nick Anderson, in his book, attempts to put some context around it. Dickinson became disorientated as he scaled the high ground and was unsure which direction his company was facing. This was unsurprising given the darkness of the jungle, his inability to see the sun, and the fact that the land was a tangle of tree roots, spurs and ravines. Turning his company to face downhill, he led his men in a frenzied charge towards what he assumed the Japanese to be. Unfortunately, the charge was misdirected and, skewing off course, it instead fell on the Australians who were bunched up on the Kokoda trail waiting to retreat, in addition to the Japanese blocking force. The Australians on the trail thought they were being attacked by the Japanese and fired back. Large groups of Maroubra force, including Key and many of his headquarters staff, were separated as men fled off the trail to escape the savage crossfire. The Japanese blocking force was broken, but the toll of casualties was heavy, and many men were isolated from the main body of Maroubra force. He goes on to say that the final chaotic moments of the Battle of Isurava Abouari appear to have ensured that this unfortunate incident is not widely known. The debacle presents a stark illustration of the extreme difficulty of withdrawing men while under attack by the enemy. And I would add to that, in the jungle. Because of all of the factors that we discussed at the start of this, the difficulties with command and control, the short distances at which contact occurs, and the difficulty in navigating. And remember, Captain Dickinson probably wouldn't have had a clear picture of how the battle was unfolding because there was no map. There was no map held at Battalion Headquarters where the position of friendly forces was laid out, and there was no maps with which he could navigate with. This event transformed what had been an orderly withdrawal up until that point into a shambles. The fact that this had occurred was hinted at in many places, which, unless you know that it actually happened, I don't think that you would pick up on the fact that it was a friendly fire incident. For instance, one of the war diaries states, "At 17:00 hours, a terrific burst of fire swept the track where Battalion Headquarters were in position. This fire appeared to come from two directions, from the southwest and the west. Alpha and Bravo companies further to the rear had opened up earlier. Heavy firing and much yelling continued for some minutes. Casualties occurred amongst Battalion Headquarters, Alpha, Bravo and Charlie companies, and a platoon of the 2nd 16th Battalion." One of the things that you hear from numerous soldiers when you're listening to the oral histories of the Battle of Isurava at the War Memorial is words to the effect of, "I never even got to see a Jap and I was wounded." Originally, I thought that this was because of the fact that they were fighting in the jungle, but I think it's more of the fact that it was a blue on blue. The 2nd 14th War Diary states, "By 0400 hours, the withdrawal had been completed. Apart from casualties and missing, troops occupied the ridge southeast of the creek crossing south of Ololo. Missing personnel at this stage totalled 172, including the CO, Adjutant, IO, Captain Buckler, Lieutenants Treacy, Butler, Pierce, Gardner, Davis, and the RSM. Stretcher patients and walking wounded were sent on from here. The 2nd 16th covered the withdrawal along the track south of Ololo. Critically, despite these losses, the battalion continues on. The next day, rations for one day issued to troops moving through the village. At 16:30 hours, all stretcher cases and patients from Creek were moved back through the unit's lines. By 1800 hours, troops were disposed. 39th Battalion on the flat at the village, our Bravo Company forward, with elements of Headquarters, Alpha and Don companies on the salient slightly rear of Battalion Headquarters. Charlie Company moved further back along the high feature where they patrolled during the night. Temporary appointments in unit were as follows: Captain P.E. Roden as CO, Captain H.E. Dickinson as 2IC, Lance Corporal Watson acting as Intelligence Officer, Warrant Officer 2 Bartlett as RSM, Lieutenant J.R. Greenwood as OC of Headquarters and Alpha Companies, Captain C.C.P. Nye, Bravo Company, Lieutenant A.S.D.J. McGavin, Charlie Company, and Captain R.W.C. Cameron, Don Company. As expected, the battalion continues to carry on its part in the fighting withdrawal. In Anderson's to Kokoda, he writes, Lieutenant Colonel Key was captured some 10 days later by the Japanese and subsequently executed. Lieutenant Bissett and a handful of companions regained the battalion lines 5 days later. Some of the remaining headquarters men were missing for a number of weeks. The unobtrusive, quietly spoken Key had led the 2nd 14th Battalion with great distinction during a battle that had demanded the dual qualities of sound, decisive professional judgment and cool determination. For me, we come to one of the really important lessons of the Battle of Isurava and indeed the Kokoda campaign. On the 12th of August, the 2nd 14th Infantry Battalion had a posted strength of 827 all ranks. The 2nd 16th, 795. On the 10th of September, not even one full month later, a composite battalion was formed that had a posted strength of less than 300 men. Some were wounded, some were dead, many were missing. Some would make their way back to Australian lines, others would be captured by the Japanese and executed. We go back to the original question that I posed at the start of this podcast. What are the risk mitigations that can be put in place to minimise the chances of friendly fire? Obviously, the actions of the enemy when they're placing pressure on a battalion or a brigade increase the chances of an unfortunate incident like this. However, how well prepared were the soldiers of the 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th for that matter? Many of them were veteran troops, combat experienced, over 2 years of time in the 2nd AIF. For many of them, it wasn't their first contact. However, it was their first contact in the jungle. I was reading through the war diary of the 2nd 16th Battalion because I wanted to understand what sort of work was it that they were doing, what sort of training was it that they were doing to prepare them for the rigours of combat on the Kokoda track. Interesting, 2nd of August 1942. We are just 24 days before the Battle of Isurava. And I get a little bit confused because I'm trying to find out what training they're doing and I'm reading through the war diary and it says points. Don Company, 16 points, 230%. Charlie Company, 12 points, 109%. And I'm thinking, what are we ranking the companies on? But then I realise that is the battalion football ladder. So Don Company is significantly better. You wouldn't want to be playing for Bravo Company. They're only on 4 points. Critically, Don Company, 13 goals, 13 behinds, defeated Alpha Company, 4 goals, 1 behind. That's 2nd 16th, 2nd 14th, 2nd of August, weather fine and cool, quiet day. Battalion 1st and 2nd football teams had a decisive win at Umundi during the afternoon. The local people cooperated and provided afternoon tea. They will be in decisive combat in less than 1 month and they are still in Australia with no idea that they are going to be deploying to New Guinea because I don't think they would have been playing football if that was what they thought. On the 4th, the war diary states, word received that the unit was to prepare for a 2-day exercise. COs were informed that units were moving by sea to the north coast of Queensland. The 5th, 0100 hours, unit transport left for embarkation in charge of TO. Preparations completed for move of the remainder of the unit, in brackets, trial exercise. 0100 hours, remainder of unit proceed by transport to Ascot Racecourse, Brisbane, where together with 2nd 16th and 2nd 10th Battalions, unit was breakfasted at 0600 hours. 0700 hours, unit transported to Wharf where it boarded SS James Fenimore Cooper at approximately 1000 hours. Ship sailed at 1200 hours. There's 5 days spent on the troop ship. However, there's no instruction on jungle warfare. There's no instruction on likely tasks. It looks like they're heading to an exercise because there's not even any battle prep for the exercise. 12th of August, Port Moresby. Arrival at Port Moresby, 0930 hours. All personnel, with the exception of those in charge of vehicles and unit equipment, disembarked from vessel to RAN corvettes and were ferried ashore where they embussed and were transported to Atiki, approximately 30 miles east of Port Moresby. The embussing and move to Port Moresby was very efficiently carried out. American trucks and drivers assisted in the movement. Heavy rain greeted the troops on arrival, but majority kept dry during the night by building small grass huts. Some companies arrived in the dark owing to difficult conditions for road transport. It's 8 months since the shambolic arrival of the 39th and 53rd Battalions. Things appear to be a little bit better, but still there is no accommodation for the troops when they arrive. The 2nd 14th's War Diary includes the training syllabus for the 9th to 11th of August. 9th of August, 2-hour lectures to include lecture on Japanese tactics, signalling, semaphore, and weapon training. 10th of August, signalling, semaphore. Compass, lecture, defence in jungle country. Defence always to be an offensive and destructive basis. Consider company localities defence in close country, firstly without any road avenues, secondly when situated on road. Weapon training and 1 period by company arrangement. 11th of August, signalling, semaphore. Lectures, attack in jungle country, consider automatic drills for forward platoon. Lecture, ops in Malaya, ATM 11. Compass, 1 period by company arrangement. You can see the CO is trying to get the battalion up to speed for combat in New Guinea. We can also see that he is doing the best with what he's got. Semaphore may not be the most useful skill when you are on the Kokoda track, and the range with which you can see is going to be less than 5 metres most of the time. This is the training program for the 9th, 10th and 11th. It is on the 16th that they move out to Uberi. This is just 5 extra days to acclimatise to the conditions in New Guinea and to learn everything that they need to know for combat with the Japanese in jungle. The employment of the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th seems to be quite rushed. To what degree was there thinking that these veteran troops would be able to fight the Japanese in the jungle? And to what degree was it driven by the rapid advance of the Japanese down the Kokoda track? The realisation for Morris, Blamey and MacArthur that there was no gap, there was going to be no Thermopylae on the Kokoda track, which could be held against all comers. It seems that once again, we've got the same problems that we saw with the employment of the 39th and 53rd Battalion, the employment of troops who just haven't been trained to fight the Japanese or nor in the jungle. This is a mistake. It's a big mistake, and we see that in the fact that these 2 fine battalions were reduced to 1 composite battalion of just 300 soldiers after less than 4 weeks in combat. The friendly fire incident at Isurava was a tragic mistake, brought around by the confusion of combat and the gulf of knowledge between desert combat and jungle combat. The brigade experts in the TTPs of desert